The gavel came down with a sharp, dry crack, and in that exact moment, Lauren Hale smiled like someone who had finally cast off the last burden of her life. She believed she had won completely cleanly, decisively. She believed she had escaped a man she had long regarded as a stain on the flawless silk dress of her upper-class existence. A man perpetually coated in metal dust oil and rust. Someone who never belonged in a world of champagne flutes and crystal chandeliers. Ethan Cole sat at the defendant's table, his back straight, his hands resting calmly on the dark time-worn wood. The cuffs of his old jacket were frayed out of place in the solemn courtroom, yet he showed no trace of embarrassment. His eyes were disturbingly calm, with no begging, no resentment, not a single sign of a man about to lose everything. Lauren did not even look at him. She was busy texting beneath the table, the corner of her mouth lifted in quiet triumph. In the front row, Derek Vaughn sat upright in his tailored suit, an expensive watch flashing as he moved his wrist. His gaze was fixed on Ethan, not as one looks at a person, but as one looks at an obstacle about to be removed. In Lauren's mind, the future was already complete. Cash from the joint account, the penthouse overlooking the water, a brand new sports car, a pristine life, free of the smell of rusted steel and the roar of crushing machines every morning. Ethan would be left holding the sealed recycling yard environmental penalties and a mountain of debt ready to swallow him whole. To Lauren, it was a beautiful form of justice. The judge raised her head and spoke slowly, deliberately, asking Lauren to confirm one final time that she understood every clause that she was signing of her own free will, that she was relinquishing all rights to Ethan's land and business, including anything that might emerge from it in the future, whatever that might be. Lauren answered instantly, firmly, without hesitation. She even let out a faint laugh, as if the question itself were an insult to her intelligence. In her mind, it was nothing more than toxic land, industrial waste, something she had always despised. Ethan tilted his head slightly, his eyes passing over Lauren's face, before settling on Derek for a brief moment. That moment was fleeting, but Derek felt a chill run down his spine, as if someone had just walked across a grave he did not yet realize belonged to him. No one in the room knew that just one day earlier, Ethan had stood among the scrap metal Lauren called trash-gripping documents, powerful enough to overturn the entire game. No one knew that what Derek believed had been buried forever was merely sleeping, waiting for a signature to wake it. Lauren signed her name the stroke of the pen firm, and confident. She slid the papers forward, her eyes glowing with victory. Derek nodded in satisfaction, his fingers moving quickly across his phone as he sent a short message. The plan was complete. The prey was secured. The gavel struck again, and the agreement became official. At that moment, Lauren finally turned to look at Ethan for the first time since entering the courtroom. Her gaze was empty and cold, as if she were looking at a stranger, a loser, a closed chapter. But Ethan did not lower his head. He drew a slow breath, his heart beating steadily in his chest, strong and unwavering like the old engines that had followed him his entire life. He knew that from this second on, Lauren had personally sealed the only door leading to a truth that could have changed everything for her. She had chosen money. She had chosen betrayal. She had chosen to walk away. And Ethan would let justice come quietly without rage, but with a cruelty so absolute that no one in that courtroom would ever forget it. The hearing was not yet over, but the real game had only just begun. The fracture did not begin with shouting. It began on a very quiet morning when Ethan stood among metal piles still damp with dew and realized that Lauren had stopped asking about his workday a long time ago. Ethan Cole grew up with the smell of cut steel and the constant collision of crushing machines. His family's demolition materials recycling business sat near the southern industrial port of Seattle, a stretch of land permanently coated in gray dust and sea mist. 3 generations of coalmen had poured their sweat into that ground, from his grandfather to his father, and then to Ethan. To them, rusted steel was not trash. It was wages, responsibility, and dignity. Ethan walked between towering stacks of metal, his calloused hand brushing cold surfaces, his eyes familiar and focused, as if reading a map only he could understand. Lauren was the opposite. She belonged to a world of glass walls and white lights. The scent of expensive perfume always arrived before she did. She worked in high-end real estate, where every word was polished and every handshake carried profit. She spoke of penthouses, waterfront views, and project launch parties, where everyone smiled but no one meant it. In that world, Ethan was an image that did not fit a rough scratch on the flawless surface Lauren worked so hard to maintain. At first, Lauren tried. She once stood in the kitchen frowning as Ethan walked in with the smell of machine oil still clinging to his clothes. She once asked if he could change before dinner. Then she stopped asking. She began coming home later, usually after client meetings. Her phone screen was always lit, messages arriving and disappearing faster than Ethan's eyes could follow. Derek Vaughn entered the picture like a perfect explanation for the change. He was not only an environmental oversight official, but also a familiar presence at nearly every networking event Lauren attended. Derek spoke smoothly, his gaze sharp and cold. He knew how to make people feel noticed and valued. To Lauren, Derek was a door to higher levels, places Ethan could never reach. Ethan met Derek for the first time at a client reception for Lauren's company. Derek shook his hand. The grip controlled the smile. Polite, but his eyes carried no warmth. In that brief moment, Ethan felt measured, judged, and placed on a very low shelf. Derek looked at him the way one looks at an old warehouse, something destined to be torn down to make room for something newer and shinier. Small distances began to accumulate. Lauren complained that Ethan did not understand her pressure. Ethan stayed silent because he did not expect her to understand the nights he stayed awake, keeping the business from slipping over the edge. He continued transferring money on time, fixing the roof when it leaked, remembering her birthday, even if he arrived late from work. In Ethan's mind, marriage was a commitment upheld by actions, not words. But there were things he did not see, or did not want to see. Supply contracts suddenly priced far below reason. Longtime partners disappearing without explanation. New intermediary companies appearing and vanishing like ghosts. Ethan noted it as a business problem, never imagining it was directly tied to the woman he loved. Lauren saw Ethan differently. She saw a man who refused to move at her pace. At parties, when asked about her husband, she smiled and answered vaguely. She began speaking of the future in plural terms, yet no longer included Ethan in it. To her, he was a past that kept pulling her backward. Neither of them realized they had been standing at opposite ends of the same road for a long time. Ethan believed value lived in what others discarded, while Lauren believed value existed only where the light shone. Both were certain they were right, and that certainty pushed them farther apart than any argument ever could. By the time Ethan understood, the distance had grown too deep to bridge. Lauren had chosen a different world. Derek was simply the clearest symbol of that choice, and Ethan, the underestimated man, still stood among his metal piles, unaware that what he was protecting would soon become the real power that would force the world to turn and look back at him. The crystal-lit hall fell silent for a single breath when the man who did not belong there walked in, carrying with him the scent of metal and sweat from a world everyone present considered inferior. The charity gala by the harbor was Lauren's stage that night. Music drifted softly over evening gowns. Champagne glasses touched lightly, like promises no one intended to keep. Lauren stood at the center, her white dress clinging to her bare back, her smile flawless, as if rehearsed countless times. To her, this was her night, a night of nods, admiring glances, and doors quietly opening. Derek stood beside her, playing the role of an invisible patron. He spoke to guests in a calm, confident tone, his sharp eyes scanning faces with precision. In Derek's mind, everything was falling perfectly into place. The connections, the unspoken deals, and the woman at his side, drifting further and further away from the outdated world she once called marriage. Ethan arrived late, not because he forgot, but because a malfunction at the recycling yard forced him to stay until the last possible minute. He showered quickly, changed into the cleanest shirt he owned, yet the smell of machine oil followed him like a loyal shadow. His old pickup truck parked among rows of gleaming luxury cars looked like a misplaced creature. From the moment he stepped inside, Ethan felt the probing looks, curiosity, and disdain carefully hidden behind polite social smiles. He did not come empty-handed. In his hands was a simple wooden box. Inside was something he had spent many late nights creating after the workers had gone home, when only the hiss of welding and blue sparks lit the dark yard. It was a small metal boat, its hull shaped from recycled steel, the weld lines smooth and deliberate, the sail made from thin alloy, carefully polished. To Ethan, the boat symbolized family, the idea of crossing rough waters together, no matter how violent the sea became. As he moved toward the center of the room, conversations slowed. Shiny leather shoes paused. A few eyes narrowed, trying to understand why this man was here. Lauren turned around. The smile on her lips froze for a fleeting moment, just long enough for Ethan to notice, just long enough for his heart to tighten. He opened the box. The metal reflected the lights shimmering in a raw and honest way. The room held its breath. Then Derek laughed a soft laugh, just loud enough to draw attention. He stepped closer, swirling his champagne glass, his eyes fixed on the gift, as if examining an odd exhibit. Derek spoke his voice, carrying a carefully sharpened mockery. He asked whether this was the latest product from Ethan's recycling yard, then joked that selling it by weight might be enough to cover his parking fee for the night. Laughter erupted around the room, spreading quickly, sharp and cold. Ethan remained still. Each laugh felt like a thin blade cutting deeper into his chest. Lauren's face flushed, but she said nothing. She did not explain. She did not defend him. She bent down, picked up the metal boat, and placed it heavily onto the marble floor. The sound of metal striking stone echoed with finality. Derek nudged the boat with the tip of his shoe, sending it sliding across the floor between laughing high heels. In that moment, Ethan did not only see his gift being trampled. He saw the sleepless nights, the cuts on his hands from sharp steel, the years he believed love could be built through patience and labor. All of it lay on the floor, turned into a joke. Lauren finally spoke, but not for him. She apologized to the guests and said that Ethan simply did not understand occasions like this. Her words were gentle, yet they fell like a hammer. To her, he was a mistake that needed explaining, not a man who deserved respect. Ethan turned and walked away. Behind him, laughter continued, and Derek leaned in to whisper something into Lauren's ear, making her laugh along with him. No one in that room knew that in the moment of that public humiliation, a decision had been made. Not loudly, not in anger, but it couldn't be undone. When the door closed behind Ethan, he was no longer a man who merely endured. In the darkness of the metal yard, the place that had been mocked and dismissed another kind of power was quietly taking shape. And that luxurious party, with all its light and laughter, had just unknowingly become the starting point of the downfall of those who believed they stood at the very top. The truth revealed itself not through a confession, but through an accidental touch on the recording button inside a darkened truck cabin. That night, Ethan did not go inside immediately after the gala. He stayed in his old pickup parked beneath the trees, outside the luxury apartment building, pretending to check the engine. Outside, yellow streetlights washed over the windshield like a layer of false paint. Inside, the air was thick and still so quiet he could hear his own heartbeat. Then Lauren's voice cut through the half-closed door, sharp and fast, nothing like the gentle tone she used with guests. Derek answered calm and firm, the voice of a man used to giving orders and being obeyed. Ethan was not trying to eavesdrop, but every word fell into his ears with brutal clarity. They spoke about his recycling yard as if it were a dead piece of land. They discussed how to use authority to turn suspicion into a conclusion, inspections into seizures, fines into a killing blow. Derek laid out each step, each timeline, each agency that would be involved. Lauren laughed and asked whether it would be fast enough to force him into bankruptcy. Derek replied that a few weeks would be enough, after which they would buy the land back at a laughable price, clean legal and massively profitable. By the time Ethan realized his hands were clenched white around the steering wheel, the recording device in the truck had already been running for some time. He did not move. He did not breathe deeply. He let every word of betrayal carve itself into the night, letting the truth bind those who believed they held all the power. In that moment, something inside him broke open, not from pain, but from clarity. The woman he loved was not just leaving him, she was actively destroying everything he and his family had built. And the man standing beside her wasn't a chance seducer, but the architect of a cold, calculated plot. In the days that followed, Ethan began to see the world differently. He reviewed every contract, every invoice, every partner who had disappeared without explanation. The intermediary companies that appeared and vanished the prices, pushed down to impossible levels, the vague clauses he had once ignored out of trust, all of it suddenly aligned into a picture so clear it was terrifying. This was not business failure. This was a hunt. Lauren lived inside the illusion of victory. She came home less often, stayed late at the office more frequently. When she did see Ethan, her eyes avoided his, her voice distant, as if he had already become an inconvenient fragment of the past. In her mind, the plan was complete. Only the final procedures remained. She believed she had been clever, that she had chosen the right side of power. Derek did too. His confidence grew into carelessness. Calls were made in places that were not secure enough. Orders were given in the familiar tone of command. He believed that a man like Ethan, quiet and coated in dust, would never understand how this game worked, let alone fight back. But Ethan was no longer the man of silent evenings and endurance. He began backing up everything, storing it carefully, organizing it with precision. He sought out an old lawyer, a man who had seen enough collapses to no longer trust appearances. The lawyer listened without interrupting, then nodded slowly. He said this was not just a divorce. It was a legal war, one in which the weakest figure on paper might actually be holding the trump card. Ethan understood that if he reacted too early, everything would vanish. The truth needed timing. It needed a moment when no one could take back a word or a signature. Instead of exploding in anger, he chose silence. Instead of resisting, he stepped back. He began to play the role of a man who was losing, who was exhausted, who was slowly falling apart. A perfect performance for people drunk on victory. Inside, Ethan, the anger did not disappear. It was compressed and forged into something sharper. No longer an emotion, but a will. He did not want revenge through shouting. He wanted revenge through truth, through the law, through the very systems Lauren and Derek believed he would never reach. That night, standing alone in the dark recycling yard, harbor winds cutting across cold steel, Ethan no longer felt surrounded. He saw the road ahead clearly, narrow and dangerous, but real. And for the first time since the gala, he knew one thing with certainty. The game had turned. And those who believed themselves, the hunters, would soon realize they were standing at the center of a trap they had built themselves. That morning, the gates of the recycling yard did not open for workers. They opened for a convoy, marked with authority, and in a single moment, Ethan's world froze in place. Tires screeched against concrete, still damp with morning dew. Heavy footsteps echoed in steady, decisive rhythm. The man in charge read the order in a voice stripped of emotion, each word landing like a nail driven into the ground. The recycling facility was being sealed for investigation of environmental violations. All operations were to cease immediately. Yellow warning tape was stretched across machines, pillars, and fences, wrapping them like fresh scars on the body of something still alive. Ethan stood motionless. He did not argue. He did not ask questions. He simply watched as official seals were placed on the machines he had repaired with his own hands over many years. The familiar smell of steel and oil lingered now, mixed with the scent of an ending. In his mind, everything slowed down, becoming terrifyingly clear. This was the next step, exactly as Derek had described in the recording. Not sooner, not later. Less than an hour afterward, Ethan's phone vibrated. The voice of his longtime bank manager came through, polite yet cold. Due to increased legal risk, all accounts and credit lines associated with his business would be temporarily frozen. The decision took effect immediately. Ethan thanked him and ended the call. His hand tightened around the old phone until his knuckles turned white. The dominoes began to fall. The insurance company sent notice of cancellation citing risk levels beyond acceptable limits. Longtime partners called with apologetic voices, explaining they could not continue working with a company under environmental investigation. Another did not even call, sending only a brief, emotionless email. Contract terminated, effective immediately. In a single morning, Ethan went from a stable business owner to a man cut off from everything. Workers gathered at the edge of the yard, eyes filled with worry, afraid to ask questions. They looked at him as if he were about to be swept away by a powerful current. Ethan walked over and told them to go home early, that he would be in touch. His voice was so calm, it made some of them even more uneasy. By afternoon, the article appeared. The front page of a local paper, a large photo showing the sealed yard from a distance. The text spoke of severe pollution of negligence by a family business, of a threat to the community. Every sentence was sharpened to provoke outrage. Ethan read it slowly. He recognized the tone, the structure, the guiding hand behind it. Derek did not just want him bankrupt, he wanted him publicly destroyed. Lauren called that evening. Her voice was composed, almost relieved. She said the situation had become too serious, that it would be best to move quickly with the divorce, so each of them could pursue separate paths. She spoke as if offering practical advice, even kindness. Ethan listened without interrupting. In his mind, every word aligned perfectly with what had been recorded that night. When the call ended, Ethan sat alone in the small office beside the yard. The fluorescent light flickered. On the desk lay ledgers, contracts, and old photographs of his father, standing among piles of steel, smiling with pride. Ethan closed his eyes for a long moment. He allowed himself to fully feel what it meant to be cornered. Fear, rage, isolation. Then he opened his eyes. What was happening was indeed a slaughter, but not a random one. It was designed, and anything designed has weaknesses. Ethan understood that those surrounding him believed he had already fallen. They believed he would sell everything, sign anything to escape, except the role of the defeated man. He stood and stepped outside. Harbor winds swept through the yard, making the warning tape rattle softly. Ethan placed his hand on a cold block of steel. In the gray light of dusk, the recycling yard looked like an abandoned battlefield. But to him, it was still his territory. And deep inside, Ethan knew that if they had pushed him this far, then the next move would leave no room for compromise. They thought this was the moment he would collapse. In truth, it was only the moment he stopped pretending not to see the blade pressed against his throat. And when a man has no path left but forward, what remains is a calm, ruthless clarity they never imagined he possessed. The first counterstrike did not come with gunfire or loud confrontation. It came in the form of a thin envelope sent quietly, at a moment when no one was paying attention to the man already written off as a loser. After the recycling yard was sealed, Ethan vanished from every place people expected to see him. No press conferences, no complaints, no pleas for help. To those watching from a distance, he looked like a wounded animal that had crawled into the dark to wait for death. But inside the small room behind the yard, a desk lamp burned every night. On the old wooden table, stacks of documents were opened, sorted, and marked with care. Ethan no longer studied them as a businessman, but with the eyes of a man preparing for war. He traced every stream of money, payments that appeared legitimate but flowed through intermediary companies with no offices and no real employees. Consulting contracts Lauren once bragged about as career achievements now revealed themselves as shadowy bridges between real estate firms and manipulated projects. Ethan felt a chill as he understood something crucial. The attack on his recycling yard was not the final objective. It was only a small link in a much larger network where money was laundered through paperwork and power was hidden behind official seals. The elderly lawyer across from Ethan turned page after page in silence. When he finally looked up, doubt was gone from his eyes. He spoke slowly, saying this was not just abuse of authority, it was organized fraud. And if Ethan wanted to survive, he could not simply defend himself. He had to strike where they were unprepared. The decision was made on a moonless night. Ethan submitted a financial complaint to the market oversight authorities, attaching copies of irregular money flows shell companies and repeated signatures. No name, no emotion, only truth presented dryly, but sharp as a blade. At the same time, another dossier was delivered to a federal contact where cases involving national interests were never ignored. Across the city, Lauren began to feel the first tremors. A close colleague was summoned for questioning and never returned. A project was suspended indefinitely under the excuse of internal review. Questions surfaced in meetings that no one had dared to ask before. Lauren maintained her smile and confident posture, but inside a vague unease began to grow. She called Derek more often, asked more questions, yet his replies grew shorter and increasingly impatient. Derek sensed danger more clearly, even if he did not know its source. Familiar partners suddenly fell silent. A call was cut off mid-sentence. An appointment was cancelled without explanation. Still, years of confidence convinced Derek he remained in control. In his mind, Ethan was still just a piece already removed from the board. Ethan knew they would not look in his direction, and that was his advantage. He continued to play the role of a broken man. He went to the local bar, drank more than usual, spoke bitterly about having to sell the land, about a life with no way out. The words spread quickly, exactly as he intended. Lauren heard them and felt relieved. Derek heard them and smiled. The trap was closing. One late afternoon, Ethan's lawyer received a confirmation call. The complaint had been accepted. A preliminary investigation had begun. Ethan did not celebrate. He simply nodded and turned off the light in his office. The first step was complete. No one had been arrested. No one had been questioned. But the gears had begun to turn, and once they turned, no smile or borrowed authority could stop them. That night, Ethan stood alone in the dark recycling yard, listening to the wind thread through steel locked behind warning seals. He no longer felt like he was waiting. He was moving forward step by deliberate step. They believed he had been driven into a corner. In truth, he had just opened another path, one where truth would walk first and justice would follow behind it, cold, relentless, and asking permission from no one. She filed for divorce on the very morning Ethan was being labeled by the entire city as an environmental offender. Lauren appeared with her lawyer in a flawless outfit, her expression calm to the point of coldness, as if everything that had just happened to Ethan was merely a minor inconvenience, something that had nothing to do with her. The paperwork was submitted quickly, cleanly, precisely. No tears, no hesitation. Every line was sharpened like a blade aimed directly at what little Ethan had left after the recent siege. Lauren's demands were clear. The cash in the joint accounts, the luxury waterfront apartment, the collection of vintage cars Ethan had spent a lifetime restoring piece by piece. In exchange, she was willing to let Ethan keep the sealed recycling yard, along with all legal responsibility and the looming penalties attached to it. It looked like a fair trade on the surface, but in truth, it was a final sentence for a man already pushed to the edge. Ethan read the petition in silence. No reaction, no anger. His eyes moved across the clauses as if he were reviewing a script whose ending he already knew. His lawyer sat across from him saying nothing, waiting for a signal. And Ethan understood that this was the moment every ounce of patience he had stored up would be put to use. The negotiation took place in a law office overlooking the city center. Glass walls, polished wood tables, the faint scent of perfume in the air. Lauren sat upright, one hand resting on the documents, like someone holding certain victory. Her lawyer presented the terms in a professional tone, repeatedly emphasizing Ethan's critical financial situation, the legal risks ahead, and Lauren's generosity in agreeing to shoulder a small portion of marital responsibility. Ethan let them talk. He lowered his head, fingers interlaced, shoulders slightly slumped, the perfect image of a man running out of strength. When it was his turn, he looked up, his voice slightly hoarse, just enough to convey helplessness. He said he had no options left, that he only wanted everything to end peacefully, that he was willing to sign if it meant both of them could be free. Lauren felt relief bloom inside her. She looked at the man across the table and saw exactly what she expected, a defeated man, someone who had finally let go. Then Ethan presented his single condition. He spoke slowly, every word clear. If Lauren wanted a complete break, it had to be written explicitly into the agreement. She had to permanently relinquish all rights connected to the recycling yard and his business, not just now, but forever. Anything that might be discovered, generated, or extracted from that land in the future would have nothing to do with her. No disputes, no return, no exceptions. Lauren's lawyer frowned. Lauren laughed softly with a trace of contempt. In her mind, the condition was nothing more than a final meaningless struggle, a desperate attempt to cling to something worthless. To her, that land was only a burden, a source of endless trouble she was eager to discard. She glanced toward the man sitting quietly in the corner of the room. Derek. He was there as an advisor, his expression composed and confident. Derek gave a small nod, subtle but decisive. It was enough for Lauren to understand there was no risk. In fact, he saw the clause as beneficial, one more signature to bind Ethan tighter to debt and scandal. Lauren agreed. She instructed her lawyer to revise the clause to make it absolute and irreversible. Every right, every future possibility eliminated. She signed without hesitation, as casually as signing a routine bill. Ethan signed last. His hand trembled slightly enough to complete the performance. Inside, everything had gone strangely quiet. No fear, no anger, only the cold focus of a man who had just placed the most important piece on the board. When the negotiation ended, Lauren left feeling lighter. She believed she had finally cut away a troublesome chapter of her life and stepped closer to the future she wanted. Derek believed the same. Neither of them looked back at the man still seated in the room, his gaze resting on the signatures that had just been written. Ethan waited until the door closed. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a few brief seconds. The trap was set. And most importantly, the people who needed to walk into it had done so willingly, with smiles on their faces. The truth lay beneath their feet, deeper than anyone dared to imagine. And all it took was a drill, bit hitting the right spot for the familiar order of things to begin collapsing. On the first night after the agreement was signed, Ethan returned to the recycling yard after the city had fallen asleep. Streetlights did not reach this place. Harbor winds swept through the sealed warning tape, producing a dry, rattling sound like a muted warning. Ethan unlocked the prefabricated office behind the yard, switched on the light, and called the only person he trusted, Dr. Raymond Pierce, a retired geologist who had spent his life chasing signs others ignored. Raymond arrived near dawn. He was older than the last time Ethan had seen him, his hair white, his back slightly bent, but his eyes were still sharp enough to cut stone. He asked few questions, only requested the site maps, old geological records, and the environmental reports Ethan had kept. As Raymond studied them, he paused longer at certain points, tapping the paper lightly, as if listening to a distant heartbeat. They began drilling at a corner of the yard, long considered useless, a spot previous inspections had dismissed with a few cold lines of text. The drill descended slowly, steadily. The first layers revealed nothing but soil gravel and scraps of metal. Ethan felt his throat tighten. If there was nothing beneath, he would still face an empty future, even with the trap already closed. At the next depth, the drill vibrated. Raymond signaled to stop. He crouched, took a sample, and examined it under the light. In his hand, the fragments shimmered with an unfamiliar hue, not gray, not brown, but a faint, unmistakable bluish tint. Raymond did not speak immediately. He opened a portable analysis device and powered it on. The screen glowed in the darkness as data scrolled rapidly, then froze. Ethan heard Raymond exhale sharply before he spoke. This was not ordinary. The concentration was unreal. Not a small vein, but a massive structure extending beneath the entire property. Raymond looked up at Ethan, astonishment clear in his eyes. He said this was a strategic resource, the kind governments and corporations fought over in silence. Ethan did not celebrate. He stood still, fists clenched, as if holding a colossal door that had just cracked open. Lauren's words about the land being worthless echoed painfully in his mind. She had signed away every right connected to this place permanently. The days that followed unfolded in absolute secrecy. Raymond and Ethan drilled at multiple locations. The results were consistent, undeniable. This wasn't luck. It was a forgotten treasure hidden beneath layers of dust and prejudice. Raymond prepared a preliminary report, encrypted the data, and stored everything offline. He warned that if this information leaked too early, forces powerful enough to crush anyone in their way would descend instantly. Ethan understood. Through old connections his father had once built, he contacted a federal liaison. The exchange was brief and cautious. Only essential questions, only carefully measured answers. A preliminary understanding was reached with one condition: everything had to remain confidential until Ethan's personal legal matters were finalized. Elsewhere in the city, Lauren slept soundly. She believed she had shed her final burden. Derek believed the same. Neither of them knew that beneath the land they despised a truth was quietly waiting to rise, impossible to bury any longer. Late at night, Ethan stood alone in the yard again. The wind was stronger now, carrying the smell of salt and metal. He looked down at the ground beneath his feet and no longer saw waste or debt. He saw a beginning, not of blind revenge, but of a new balance. He understood that from this moment on, he was no longer merely defending himself. He was holding something powerful enough to force even those who once mocked him to bow their heads. But Ethan also knew that real power was not in shouting the truth. It was in knowing exactly when to remain silent. Beneath the cold earth, the treasure had slept for decades. Now it was awake at the right time in the right hands. Not to enrich the greedy, but to expose choices, mistakes, and the price of contempt. The courtroom was more crowded than usual that day, and the moment the doors closed, the air tightened like a string pulled to the breaking point. Ethan entered with his familiar appearance, the worn jacket, the quiet expression, the perfect image of a man pushed to the edge. He took his seat at the defendant's table, back straight, hands resting calmly on his knees. Across from him, Lauren appeared radiant in an elegant outfit, moving with the lightness of someone about to finish an annoying formality. Derek sat in the row behind her. Arms crossed, his expression composed the confidence of a man who believed everything was already under control. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Her voice carried steadily as she asked both parties to reconfirm the divorce agreement before declaring it fully effective. Lauren was addressed first. The judge emphasized the clause regarding the waiver of rights to the recycling yard and any assets that might arise from it in the future, reading each point, clearly leaving no room for ambiguity. Lauren answered decisively. She said she understood completely that the land brought only debt and trouble, that she wanted no further connection to that place or to the man sitting across from her. Her tone was confident, almost proud. She did not look at Ethan as she spoke, as if he had already vanished from her life. The judge turned to Ethan. He simply nodded. No objections, no request for more time. His lawyer stood and confirmed that his client agreed to the signed settlement and had no further claims. Everything unfolded exactly as Lauren and Derek expected, efficient, clean, without surprise. The gavel was raised. In that instant, Lauren smiled a brief, subtle smile, but enough for Derek to notice and respond with a discreet nod. The game was over. Ethan had lost. The gavel struck. The divorce agreement officially took effect. At that precise moment, Ethan's lawyer stepped forward and requested permission to submit an additional set of documents materials that by regulation could only be disclosed after the personal settlement between the parties had been finalized. His voice was calm, yet a ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. The judge frowned and signaled for the clerk to receive the documents. She opened them, skimmed quickly, then slowed. Her expression changed not to shock, but to intense focus. The room grew still. Lauren felt a chill run down her spine, even though she did not yet understand why. The judge looked up, her voice clear and resonant. She stated that according to the newly submitted documents, the recycling yard, now under Ethan's exclusive ownership, had been evaluated by federal authorities as a site containing strategic resources with an estimated recovery and compensation value reaching tens of billions. The figure was spoken slowly and precisely, like a series of invisible blows striking the room. Lauren froze. The smile vanished from her face, as if erased. Her eyes widened, unable to process what she had just heard. Derek sprang upright, his glasses slipping from his nose and shattering against the floor with a sharp crack. In his mind, every calculation collapsed at once. Lauren stood abruptly, her voice breaking. She claimed she had been deceived, that this was fraud, that she demanded her signature be withdrawn. She pointed at Ethan, her hand trembling, as if he had suddenly become a stranger. The judge struck the gavel and called for order. She fixed Lauren with a stern gaze and explained that the agreement had been signed in a clear state of mind, with legal representation without coercion, and that the waiver clause was explicit, absolute, and irrevocable. The confidentiality surrounding the resource information was mandated by security regulations and did not constitute deception. Ethan rose. He did not raise his voice. He did not gloat. His tone was low and steady, each word falling like cooled steel. He said it was Lauren's own signature that had cost her everything, that she had chosen to abandon the land when she believed it was worthless, and that now the price of that choice had come due. He looked at her one last time. There was no hatred in his eyes, only an ending. When Ethan sat down, the courtroom remained in shock. The hearing was not yet over, but everyone understood that this moment would be remembered for a long time. The man who had been underestimated by everyone in the room had just overturned the entire board, not with shouting, not with violence, but with patience, silence, and a truth revealed at exactly the right time. No one had time to react when the men in black suits entered the courtroom, because by then Derek's fate had already been sealed long before the gavel came down. They moved quickly and decisively, without noise yet, with enough presence for everyone to understand this was not a performance. The badges on their chests reflected the cold courtroom lights. Derek turned instinctively, the confidence that once defined him stripped away, leaving only raw panic in his eyes. He did not even have time to stand before a clear, emotionless voice read out the arrest warrant listing charges tied to abuse of authority, organized fraud, contract manipulation, and endangering strategic interests. Lauren sat frozen. The sounds around her seemed to drain away. She stared at Derek, the man who had once been her source of power, now held firmly by both shoulders. His face had gone pale. Years of practiced composure dissolved in seconds. Derek opened his mouth trying to speak, but no words came. The phrases he once used to command, to threaten, to shield himself, were suddenly useless. When the handcuffs snapped shut, the sharp sound of metal cut through the air. Derek struggled on instinct and turned toward Lauren, his eyes a mix of pleading and rage. He claimed it was all a misunderstanding, that he had only followed a plan, that everything could be explained. Then his voice rose in desperation. He pointed at Lauren, shouting that she was the one who initiated it, the one who pushed, the one who wanted Ethan destroyed as quickly as possible. Lauren jumped to her feet, shaking her head violently, lips trembling. She tried to say she did not know, that she had only followed advice, that she too was a victim. No one listened. No one needed to anymore. Her words fell apart the moment they left her mouth. Ethan remained seated. He did not turn. He did not watch Derek being taken away. He did not look at Lauren as she collapsed. He understood this was not a moment for emotion. This was the closing of a long, heavy chapter. There was no triumph in his chest, only the emptiness that follows after a storm has passed. The agents escorted Derek out. Each step echoed heavily, like a countdown to the years he was about to lose. Before disappearing through the door, Derek glanced back one last time. His gaze landed on Ethan, stripped of contempt and confidence, replaced by late understanding. He had chosen the wrong opponent. The courtroom slowly filled with noise again, but it was scattered and uncertain, a mix of shock, curiosity, and fear. Lauren slumped back into her chair. The shoulders that once carried pride now sagged, as if the full weight of her choices had finally crashed down on her. She looked toward Ethan, her eyes hollow, searching for a reaction, a sign of pity, or at least a word. Ethan stood. He turned and looked at Lauren briefly. There was no hatred in his eyes, only a simple and ruthless truth. Every decision has its price, and some prices cannot be negotiated, delayed, or paid with tears. He said nothing. There was no need. His silence spoke more clearly than any accusation. Ethan turned and walked toward the courtroom doors, each step steady, unhurried. When the door opened, the light from the hallway poured in, cutting the space behind him in two. Lauren lowered her head. For the first time, she truly understood what it meant to be left behind, not by a man, but by her own choices. The world she believed was solid had collapsed, not because Ethan was cruel, but because she had misjudged the value of things she once considered insignificant. Outside, Ethan paused for a brief moment. He took a deep breath. The cool air filled his lungs, a reminder that he was still standing still, alive. He did not look back. The road ahead was long, but this time it was no longer obscured by lies or contempt. The game was over, and justice, slow but precise, had finally found the one it was meant to find. The news spread faster than any explanation, and within a single night, the entire city woke up to a new order no one had anticipated. The morning reports no longer spoke of a polluted recycling yard or a failed man. Instead, they carried careful but heavy language about a federal-level investigation, about serious violations tied to power and strategic interests. Derek's name appeared everywhere, attached to accusations that silenced anyone who read them. And in every report, Ethan's name appeared only as a quiet detail, subtle yet impossible to ignore. Ethan returned to the recycling yard early that morning. What had once been wrapped in warning tape was now guarded by uniformed personnel, standing with disciplined precision. The gate opened not for battered old trucks, but for specialized convoys moving in orderly formation. The atmosphere had completely changed. There was no longer panic, no sense of being hunted, only focus and a cold discipline unfamiliar to Ethan. A senior officer shook Ethan's hand, his gaze serious but respectful. He explained that the land had been classified as a special site, that all operations would now be directly supervised, and that Ethan's role in discovering and safeguarding the information would be formally acknowledged. Ethan nodded. He did not ask about rewards. He did not ask about recognition. For him, simply standing firm on his family's land was enough. In the days that followed, the old recycling yard gradually transformed into a new construction site. Modern machinery replaced worn equipment. Workers who had once feared for their future returned, their eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and hope. They looked at Ethan differently now, not as a man who had stumbled into luck, but as someone who had walked through fire and emerged unburned. Ethan kept his old habits. He arrived early, walked the perimeter of the land, ran his hand over blocks of steel and scraps of metal, once dismissed as waste. In the new office, he placed the metal rose back on the shelf, carefully wiping each petal clean. What had once been trampled now rested quietly, needing no defense. Elsewhere in the city, Lauren faced a completely different reality. Contracts were canceled. Calls went unanswered. Doors that once opened with a smile now slammed shut in her face. Her name surfaced in whispered conversations tied to betrayal and grave misjudgment. She left the luxury apartment and moved into a smaller, quieter place. Each evening she stared at her phone, rereading old news articles, as if hoping they might somehow change. Lauren thought of Ethan more often than she wanted to admit, not with love, but with a relentless question. How had the man she once dismissed managed to stand so firmly? The question offered no comforting answer, and it followed her into sleep each night. Derek vanished from glamorous headlines. The few mentions left spoke only of an extended investigation, closed-door hearings, and mounting charges. His name no longer carried power, only a silent warning about the cost of arrogance. One late afternoon, Ethan stood alone on the land, watching the sun sink behind newly erected cranes. The light washed everything in deep gold. He thought of his father, of the generations before him, who had held this land through sweat and belief. He understood then that this story was not truly about revenge, but about holding on to values when everything around him tried to force him to bow. Ethan drew a deep breath. He no longer felt the need to prove anything. His silence now carried a different meaning. It was not surrender, but the foundation of strength. And as darkness slowly settled over the land, once scorned, Ethan knew the final chapter was drawing near, not with shouting or spectacle, but with the quiet resolve of a man who had reclaimed his rightful place. The letter arrived on a quiet morning, thin and cheaply made, yet its weight was enough to make the room feel as if all the sound in the world had been switched off. Ethan held the envelope and stared at the trembling handwriting on the address. The sender's name was so familiar, it made his chest tighten slightly. He opened the letter slowly. The uneven lines spoke of a difficult life of illness, of loneliness. Lauren wrote that she needed a small amount of money for surgery, that life had taught her many painful lessons. She said that deep down she had always loved him, that old memories were still there, and she begged him to help her one last time for the sake of the past. Ethan read to the end. He missed nothing. His expression did not change. There was no real apology in the letter, no true admission. Only one last attempt, clumsy yet familiar, to pull him back into the role she had once assigned him. The man who gives, the man who endures, the man who is always considered the safe choice when everything else has collapsed. He folded the letter and placed it on the desk beside the metal rose, inside its glass case. Outside, the land that had once been dismissed as scrap had become a tightly guarded zone. Machines moved in steady rhythm. People worked with order and purpose. Everything had its place, just as Ethan had finally reclaimed his own. He carried the letter to the small fireplace in his office. The flame flared as the paper touched it. The words curled, darkened, and disappeared. Ethan watched until only ash remained. No anger, no satisfaction, only the necessary end of an old cycle. 1 year passed since the day everything turned. Ethan did not become a man who flaunted wealth. He still wore work clothes, still inspected the site with his own hands, still drove the old truck he had never intended to replace. But life around him had changed. He invested in the local hospital-supported workers who had lost their jobs and opened a free vocational training center for young people in the area. Not for praise, but because it was what he believed his father would have done. Lauren's name slowly faded from conversation. No more parties, no more admiring glances. She became a story told as a reminder of trading real value for a glittering surface. Derek was reduced to a name in legal records, tied to a sentence and an irreversible fall. One afternoon, Ethan stood alone in his office as sunlight slanted through the window and reflected off the metal rose. What had once been mocked and trampled now rested there as a silent witness. It needed no explanation, no defense. Its value was not in the material, but in the meaning others had failed to see. Ethan understood that the greatest revenge was not making someone suffer, but living a life no longer controlled by them. He had been underestimated for his appearance, his background, his work stained with dust and oil. Yet those very things had forged his patience, his awareness, and the strength to stand firm when betrayal came. Ethan's story did not end with applause or loud admiration. It ended with peace. A man standing firmly on his own land, understanding the value of labor loyalty, and never underestimating what seems small. And if you are listening to this story, ask yourself one thing. In your life, has there ever been someone considered ordinary, insignificant, or perhaps it was you? Sometimes the most precious thing lies right beneath our feet, hidden by prejudice and haste. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you are watching from and what time of day it is. Do not forget to like and subscribe so you do not miss the next story. Perhaps the next one will reflect your own journey.